We're looking at probably one of the most important and even powerful readings in the Bible, or passages, I guess you could say, that affects us intensely even today. This is the part where God announces, he doesn't make it yet, that's a right that he does, but he announces that Abram will be called Abraham. He is going to make a covenant with him. His legacy will cover a multitude of nations. That's huge right there, and I'll talk about that in a second. And that he is giving Abram the land of Canaan, which is where Israel is today. Now, obviously, that simple fact, that last fact, it affects everything that happens in our world, or not everything, but so much that happens in our world today, because that's the most famous piece of land in the Judeo-Christian tradition. It's there. It's Israel. So we're looking at that. But maybe one of the things we have to understand is what's going on. Remember, the Jews, as we call them today, they weren't called Jews at the time of Abraham. They were probably called Abraham's people. But the Jews were a people, or are a people, who worship the one God. Now, for us, we go, well, okay, so what? But back then, that was huge because everyone else lived a pagan existence. And so since they lived this pagan existence, then what happens is that God calls the Jews to, again, the people of Abraham, to a whole new understanding of gods and humanity. I guess you could use the term cosmology. So we're not just talking about this group of people and this God. We're talking about what ultimately becomes the beginning of an evolution of understanding. And even if we go further into this to the point we go to atheism, which obviously I don't believe, we understand that this has led us down a path from believing that the gods surround us to this understanding that there is one God, and his real existence, his real substance, besides the fact he is the source of all that is good, his real substance is not fully understood, basically until Jesus comes along. And Jesus is the Son of God. He is the face of God. But even so, Jesus makes it clear no one has ever seen the Father. So you've seen those images in art of an old man, a younger man, and a dove. Well, that's art, but that is not who God can truly be represented as. And so we come to this whole new understanding of the divine and who we are. As I explained recently on my Substack, our existence is really all about, when we look at our existence is really all about understanding who God is and who we are. And it's a growing understanding. And so in the early days, prior to the time of Abram, and also prior to the time that the Hebrew people became established in their worship of God, you had people trying to figure out about God and everything else. And so you'd have this whole understanding of, well, this seems to happen. For example, Billy Joe was struck by lightning, but he was struck by lightning just after he screamed to the skies and said, "Why do you do this to me?" And so therefore, there must be some kind of personality in the sky, maybe a sky god that's in charge of lightning, or a lightning god, and killed Billy Joe, because that's the way it appeared. I remember when I wasn't in school that long ago, but this is something that talks about a scientific understanding for the science of the time, coming from centuries ago. So I wasn't in school centuries ago, but it was teaching us this whole part of, well, this is the way it appears, so this is the way it must be. And it was that meat generates flies. You go, what? Well, that was believed. Meat generates maggots and then flies. Sorry for the image. But this is what they showed us in this old science book. Now, they weren't teaching that. They were saying this is how people used to think. And what would happen is, basically you didn't have refrigeration and everything. So you may have a piece of meat that was out, and then all of a sudden you see flies coming from the piece of meat, or maybe you start seeing maggots and then the flies, and say, oh, well, that's because meat generates flies. Of course, now we know that's ridiculous. What happens is the fly lays its eggs, if that's what they use, and then they become maggots and the whole bit. But by observing, that's the way it appeared. So the people who are surrounding Abraham are believing in all these gods and are engaged in polytheism because they determined this is the way it must be because this is the way it appears. We see that also in things like medicine, and we see that also in things like different aspects of science from the older days, when people would believe certain things because that's the way it appeared. You had the scientists, the alchemists who were looking to create gold, had no idea that you can't create gold. Well, actually, I should say, I suppose you can create gold, but it would take literally some kind of atomic surgery to do that. But they didn't know that. They went by what they observed. And of course, maybe it didn't occur to them, if you think about this, if you could create gold. If I went to Joe's Emporium and chemistry store and bought a chemistry set that could make gold, the value of gold would drop to nothing because it could be made. And so they hadn't understood that. So they're working hard to see if they could make gold and whatever they could do to create it and everything else. And obviously it never worked, but they did this based on what they could figure out. The whole story of what ultimately is Judaism and its entire history is God enters into history and he infuses history with his wisdom, and that's where everything starts to change. Now, one of the things we see in this passage is that God says, I have established you as the father of many nations. I will set you among the nations, and kings will come forth from you. That's the prophecy that we see brought forth today, but that's the prophecy that is throughout the Old Testament. But notice the word is nations. It's not a nation. It's not a king. It's nations. So Abraham becomes the father of a legacy that spreads throughout the world. And we know that story, and we know all about it. But we see this is where it begins, because what's happened is God is entered into history so that he can give his information in his wisdom, and it becomes part of who we are. This is a powerful, powerful message that we recognize. And obviously, we're seeing that within the context of coming into Holy Week, because yet again, it is God who enters into history. And when we recognize that, and God is coming into history, and we see all that, that we recognize that Jesus comes to redeem all of humanity. And with that, that whole understanding of the God of the Jews becomes universal. So now the message, as Jesus says, go out into the whole world and spread my gospel. That message does not exist until the time of Jesus, because it's God who works through the people we now call the Jews, and have done since Judaism, since Judah. now God works through them to bring a whole new understanding of who we truly are. But up until that point, and St. Paul addresses this, where we see that he only works through the Jews until the time that you have the fullness of time, and then the understanding can spread throughout the world. Because remember, in the time of Jesus, the Romans still worshipped many gods, and they were still engaged in some form of human sacrifice, because that's what you see this complaint of the apostles against Pilate, who added the blood of Galileans to his sacrifice. So we see that whole story. But now, at the death and resurrection of Jesus, a whole new message starts to spread throughout the world. And this message is a whole new understanding of cosmology. Fascinating. It's a fascinating story. So we're looking at that. We're coming to understand that. And we're looking at this powerful message to lead us to comprehend what the Lord is doing and how it all begins. And it begins with this whole conversation with Abram, who becomes Abraham, and says this whole legacy will spread to many, many nations. And of course, we see that all today. We're going to be back on the other side of the break. You're listening to the Catholic Audio Media Podcast. We're here every single Monday through Friday. Subscribe, like, spread the word, and we'll be back then. We'll see you in a minute. Did you know that the Catholic Audio Media Podcast is available on various podcast platforms? You can find us, among others, on Podbean, which is our home platform. You can find it on Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeart, among others. Just look for Catholic Audio Media, all one word. On some platforms, such as Spotify, look for Catholic Audio Media, 3 words, and subscribe and listen to the Catholic Audio Media Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Patreon, patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media, patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Check us out. Check what we have to offer, previews of upcoming podcasts, previews of upcoming columns over at catholicaudiomedia.substack.com, your ability to comment, make suggestions, even make suggestions in upcoming programs. Check us out, patreon.com, Catholic Audio Media. One of the big discussions happening on various social media platforms is the issue in regards to tipping. Now, for those of you who are not in the United States, those who work in the food industry, and tipping also flows over into other things, but we focus on the food industry here. Those, and I'm talking about restaurants and everything else, they are purposely paid below minimum wage in order that or because they are also paid partially through tipping. And that's the system. And generally, it's accepted that tipping, it's for a long time, should be about 20% of the bill. And this is a tradition we do here. Now, there's all different questions about tipping, of whether or not tipping is appropriate, or whether or not you should tip a really bad server, or whether you should tip extra a really good server. And so there's all those issues that come in. And some of these discussions happen that people will complain that someone gives a 20% tip and they'll complain it was too low, or things like that. Now, first of all, I was a busboy when I first got out of high school. Tipping, and you want to talk about tipping, the way the system worked for me was a busboy is the waitresses, because they were all waitresses at the time, the waitresses were to share their tips with me. You can see how well that worked. I mean, they were good people and stuff, but you know that they weren't going to share what they were supposed to. I mean, people were living on that money, and if they gave me a little bit less than they were supposed to, remember, they're dealing with families. I wasn't. I didn't complain, but one of the great things about it, because this is really before credit cards. I mean, credit cards were around, but not to the same level they are now. And long before debit cards and way long before PayPal and Cash App and all the other stuff. So because of tipping, I always had cash in my pocket. It was a great thing. I really loved it. Even though I never got the direct tip, but still I did get part of the waitress's tips, and it was a great deal. So in any case, so I personally like the system of tipping, and I know the servers like the system of tipping, even though a lot of it is done through credit cards now. But the complaint is how much. And again, you want to look from a Catholic perspective and always look at the bigger picture. Now, I had a situation that happened to me recently. You saw that great big snowstorm we had here in the Northeast. And I think the amount of snow we got, it was more than happened in the blizzard of 78, which crippled the whole area for days. But so I tried to drive. I got called to the hospital, so I drove to the hospital, and I made it, but I didn't make it home that easily. It was awful. And so I'm driving home, and I got stuck 3 times. It was horrible. It was a horrible experience. And I knew one guy who got stuck 3 times, and he told me there was a fire truck that got stuck and a wire truck. You know those big wire trucks? One of those got stuck. So it was just a horrible experience. And so the next day I said, well, I'm not driving to work, but I'm going to call an Uber. Now, let me explain something before I go any further. If I can, I'll take a taxi, but a taxi has to use a similar system as does Uber and Lyft. And they're out there. Curb is one. And basically, it's the same system. For what you basically do is you use that system of that particular app, which is Curb, and you order your taxi and they come, and it works great. Well, they don't do that here in Brockton, so I called an Uber, and the Uber driver picked me up in his four-wheel vehicle and took me to work, which of course is the hospital. And that made my day. That really made my day. And then in doing that, I want to make sure. I was thinking about the other day. I gave him a tip. I gave him a bigger tip than maybe I normally would. But I was thinking about the other day, I'd love to be able to tip him even more. Because he was there when I needed him, and that's an extra service. It was wonderful. Well, in any case, how do you tip? And generally, it's expected 20%. Now, if someone gives you really horrendous service, which, by the way, is rare, they might not give you the service you want, but to give you really bad service, the person has to be rude and obnoxious and not show up and everything else. I've seen that, but generally, that's got to be really bad service. If they give you a minimum standard of service, even though it's not what you like, they still are entitled to a tip, in my opinion. I'm speaking from a Catholic perspective, because they live off these tips. It's not extra income for them. It's part of their income. Now, on the same line, as you kind of look at that whole thing, how do you tip? Always think of the person. And yeah, 20%, you don't have to tip more than 20%. If you want to tip 15, some people do that, whatever, or 18, whatever. I always go 20%. By the way, it's very easy to do. You take the amount of the meal and you divide it by 10, and then multiply that number by 2, and there you'll have 20%. So that's what I do. That's how it works. But when you have an argument over tipping, should we tip the whole bit? The bottom line is, from a Catholic perspective, you want to make sure the person gets what they are due. In the United States, at least I can say for Massachusetts, servers are paid less because they live off of tipping. That's the way it works. So always understand that. And again, if someone is really rude to you or obnoxious, but, I'm 67 years old. Maybe I've had that experience once. Maybe. I can't even remember that. And so you always want to be able to, respect the person because they're working very hard for you to get whatever meal. And people, well, I didn't like this or I didn't like that. Is it really worth saying I'm not going to give them what they're due? Because essentially in the United States, they are due a 20% tip. People may disagree with that statement, but from a Catholic perspective, they're due it because it's part of how they're paid. So you have all these discussions. Some people say, well, you should be paying them 40%. No. Now, one of the arguments I saw on X, I just saw the headline, I didn't get too much into it, where someone complained about a $40 tip on a $500 bill. Now, how much should a $500 tip, a high $500 bill tip be? Should be $100. Again, you divide by 10, 500 is 50, times 2, 100. Should be $100. That's 5%, 20% of 500. They gave a $40 tip. Now, if it was a $500 bill, that would have been a lot of work. It was for several people. Yeah. What is the Catholic perspective? The Catholic perspective is at least follow the minimum rules. Minimum rules are 20%. Again, person has to really be rude, obnoxious, practically throw the food at you, maybe say bad words to before you turn around and say, I am not giving a tip. There's another tip you can give that is actually even worse than not giving a tip. It's 13 pennies. But the person has to be really, really bad to do that. Other than that, I think the Catholic perspective is 20%. If you want to give more because they've gone over and above, as in the case of the Uber driver I was talking about, absolutely. Give more, but never give less unless it really warrants it. And I would be surprised if you find that. And if someone treats you like that, you just don't go back to the restaurant. We'll be back right after this. You're listening to the Catholic Audio Media Podcast. Subscribe and like. You can now leave a message for us, which we can air and discuss on this program. Just call 617-297-7452. That's 617-297-7452. 617-297-7452. Feel free to call, leave a comment, a question, or even feedback, and we may play it on the air. I can discuss your comment or question as well, so give that a try. 617-297-7452, 617-297-7452. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Patreon. Patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Check us out. Check what we have to offer. Previews of upcoming podcasts. Previews of upcoming columns over at CatholicAudiomedia.substack.com. Your ability to comment, make suggestions, even make suggestions in upcoming programs. Check us out. Patreon.com, Catholic Audio Media. We're back. And tomorrow we're going to talk about this very ominous passage from Jeremiah where he talks about all that he is suffering. We saw that earlier in the year. And this is going to lead us, obviously, into Holy Week. Now, remember, one of the things I always point out, you see this in the Gospels, and I always focus on the first reading. But what you're going to see in Holy Week is that the Pharisees become more hardened of heart. They're demanding their world, their way, their religion, their way, and Jesus is getting in the way. So that's one of the powerful images that comes from Holy Week, which we're going to be looking at. Ending, obviously, in the powerful story of the resurrection of Jesus, which is the ultimate reality of not only Jesus resurrecting from the dead, but teaches us, as St. Paul says, that so do we, changing our whole understanding of who we truly are. So that's coming up tomorrow as we look at the first reading for the week. We'll see you then.
Yeah, you know the real is back. Father Carr Chaplain from the city of champions, dropping daily reflections coming straight from the field. The raw truth revealed for the strong-willed. It's the Greatest Act of Defiance podcast with your host Father Carr, a message built to last. The Greatest Act of Defiance podcast. That's right, the Greatest Act of Defiance. Word up. Word up. Word up.
The Catholic teaching in this podcast is reflected and presented as accurately as possible. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the Archdiocese of Boston or any other institution.